I'd like to talk about is building a little bit on what Eugenia just said, some of the mixed approaches to methods, and particularly the ones that are not necessarily quantitative and not necessarily fitting into a household survey. But the reason I thought it was better that Eugenia goes first is because if it's not clear to you by now, it should be that actually the backbone of most of what is going to be called resilience measurement in the future is going to be quantitative analysis. It's going to be complicated indices. It's going to be things that to a layperson may look pretty dense and undecipherable. But those things, getting back to some of the points that other people made earlier in the day, will tend to be standardized, will tend to sort of run roughshod over local specificity. And yet we all know, and we've all agreed several times this morning, that if we're talking about resilience, we have to be talking about it in the context of particular locations, particular peoples, particular groups, particular subgroups. And we've talked about some of the ways that those can be broken down. So we have a little bit of a problem in terms of how we actually capture these things. And so what our particular little group of the technical working group is trying to work on is called qualitative and subjective measures. Now, qualitative and subjective measures are often sort of lumped together as the things that aren't quantitative. They're actually very different kinds of information. Qualitative information is simply information that can't be reduced to numbers very well, and thus remains in the form of words or narratives. Subjective measures, on the other hand, are much more about ones that get at the perceptions of people. They may be perceptions about the severity of the impact of a shock. They may be perceptions about the impact of programs. But they also may be about how people cope in particular given circumstances and how their behaviors may be different from the behaviors of people elsewhere. This is one of the places where the kind of iterative work that goes on between qualitative and quantitative measures is important. Eugenia touched on it. And it was touched, the question was sort of posed earlier in the morning, but about standardization versus specificity. Where qualitative methods and subjective methods can really help flesh this out is by understanding a general concept and making sure that that gets somehow or other included in the analysis, but using qualitative and even subjective measures to get at what that means in that particular context. And we all know this, but we routinely forget it, and we routinely sort of run roughshod over it. Somebody asked me earlier in the morning about how one would adapt something called the Coping Strategies Index, for which I'm partly a guilty party, to a context like Somalia. It says very clearly in the beginning of the manual for doing that index how you go about some qualitative measures with focus groups or with key informants to find out exactly what sort of consumption coping behaviors are used in a given food economy or a given culture or a given location. Unfortunately, we had to put an example in that methods manual, and the example happened to come from a semi-arid mixed agro-pastoral area in eastern Kenya. We had to put an example in, so we put that one in. I have seen that module reused in Somalia. I've seen it reused in urban cities, in urban areas in Malaysia. I've seen it reused millions of times, and that wasn't the point. The point was people cope in different ways, and you can add those things up, but you have to understand first what they are, and the only way you can do that is by sort of qualitative and subjective measures. So we know these things, but we often forget them. That's the bit about how qualitative measures or subjective measures can be used to inform the more dominant forms of measurement, which, as I've already hinted, is going to be quantitative. But there are some things where quantitative measures really don't capture very well the phenomenon that we're trying to understand. And if I may, I'd like to give you an example from our own work on the Somalia famine in 2010 or 2011. And it gets at this very problematic thing called social connectedness or social capital or social networks. Our study has shown basically three major sort of categories of factors that made people more resilient or less resilient during the famine in 2011. And those three things are diversification, mobility, and social connectedness. Now, I'm sure anybody who's worked in Somalia for very long would say, well, that's not particularly interesting information. But the diversification thing is not about the diversification of livelihood strategies, and it's not necessarily even about the diversification of assets. It's about the diversification of risk. I think John hinted at this in his earlier point. I may have three completely different streams of income, but if they're all equally subject to drought, then I really don't have very much diversification in terms of being able to cope with that particular factor. And of course, in 2011, there were 5 or 6 different things going on. It wasn't just drought. So the extent to which people were actually able to survive on their own livelihoods and their own assets meant a fairly extreme degree of diversification. The mobility thing is also not surprising if you're used to thinking about pastoralists, but actually mobility between different kinds of livelihoods was also an important factor. So the ability of people to switch from a rural-based livelihood to an urban-based one was also key. But the one I'd like to talk about for just a second is the one about social connectedness. And in the context of the famine, we didn't particularly think about this at the time, but in the context of the famine, we will be talking here mainly about what's come to be called absorptive capacity. In other words, the ability of people to absorb a shock and survive, and survive in such a way that their long-term life chances are not severely undermined. And in the context of the famine, this was often referred to as having someone to cry to. And it was described to us and our researchers who could actually move around in the field as sort of 3 concentric circles. The first circle was really one about immediate family relations, face-to-face relationships, but usually amongst fairly close relatives. We've heard a lot about remittances in Somalia and the effect to which remittances buffered the impact of the shocks that led to the famine. But remittances tend to be from one person to another person, from one household to another household. They don't necessarily affect the whole community. Now, that's not entirely true, and in fact, that changed a little bit during the famine. But in that sort of first circle, relationships tend to be fixed, and a lot of the back and forth tends to be fixed. The second circle was actually more interesting. It doesn't exactly correlate to community. It doesn't exactly correlate to clan or subclan. And it doesn't exactly correlate to lineage or any other kind of obvious category. But it's kind of the collective total of those things. It might be about zakat. It was very frequently about lending resources or extending credit. So it may be with people that you don't have any particular lineage or family relationship with, but you've had a business relationship with. And it may be a variety of other things. The third circle was much more distant. It was a much more distant kind of claim on resources. It was described to us by one of our senior researchers in the following way. He said about May of 2011, his cell phone began ringing, and it was numbers that he didn't recognize, and it was people he didn't know. But they somehow knew him, or they knew his father, or they knew his family, and they said, look, we're in trouble, and we know that you've got a job in town, you've got a steady income stream, can you please help us out? So at one level, that first circle was kind of fixed. And if you had somebody in the diaspora who was remitting dollars or euros to you every month, the famine really didn't hurt you that much. You might have had to share those resources a bit farther than you usually did, but you survived okay. The third circle was a long shot. It was a shot in the dark, and it didn't really help very many people out. The critical thing of interest here is that second circle, and the sort of diversity of resources and the strength of resources, and the question of who's in and who's out in those circles. Now, we've got various ways that we try to measure social connectedness. We ask questions about how many people could you call on to help you out in a crisis, or how many people might you be willing to help out, or is there someone in your family that regularly remits money to you, etc. Those are all good indicators, but they don't really get at that question. And the interesting thing to us was you could see over time the resources that were circulating in that second circle, or the extent to which people were being granted credit by businessmen, etc. And at a certain point in time, the resources ran out. Businessmen couldn't extend any more credit. I couldn't share any more of my income with you because I had already shared it. And it was at that point that you suddenly had this kind of collapse, the collapse of that second circle. Many people have described the famine to us as the day that the sack ran completely empty. And in sort of social connectedness terms, that's when it happened. That was the, if you will, the emic or the internal or the local definition of the declaration of famine. It happened at about the same time that, through all of our objective quantitative indicators like mortality and morbidity, access to food, etc., also happened. But my point is that to understand this tricky notion of absorptive capacity, and for that matter, adaptive capacity and the other ones, but we were particularly focused on the absorptive capacity in the context of the famine. It's really important not only to understand what households themselves are doing, what resources they themselves have, but also that the resources that they can call on in that second circle, the diversity of those resources and the strength of those resources. And that is very difficult to get at in easily quantifiable terms. Nevertheless, it's still very important to what we're trying to do in this business. So, in ending, just a little bit of a plea that while this is an iterative process, and the way Eugenie outlined it is quite good, there are some things that we're actually not very good at being able to incorporate into those quantitative analytical models, and yet they may be some of the key explanatory factors in really understanding what's going on and really understanding whether or not our interventions are having any impact or not. So just a little bit of a plea, not necessarily to subsume everything under the kind of dominant modeling, but remember that there are some things out there that we're going to have to access through different methods. I will stop at that. Shall I stay here? Can I sit down now?
I think people must be getting tired. We have one very, very long question, and that's it. How can how can we as NGOs assist households in their diversification of risk, in particular across numerous activities, but in particular against multiple risks?
How can we as NGOs do that?
Mm-hmm.
I think you got about 60 experts around the room that all know more about probably that than I do. But I think in a quick answer, it would be through some kind of fairly constant feedback about all the things that we're doing in the name of whatever it may be, in the name of asset diversification, in the name of education, in the name of improving access to social services, etc. Are those actually making you more diversified in your ability to cope with shocks? But I think we can also look at it in terms of understanding the full range of shocks that people are subject to, and using a little bit of logical inference to look at this ourselves. One of the things that I found quite striking in the conference in Addis Ababa last week was the extent to which we still look at shocks or categories of shocks in a very much isolated way. There was a panel that talked about drought. There was a panel, thank God, that talked about conflict. There was a panel that talked about food price shocks. But there was no panel that talked about the way these come together. And if you look at an extreme example like the famine in Somalia, it was all of those things plus a number of much higher level political factors that prevented much of the potential to mitigate any of those shocks. So it was really all of the above.